Well, good evening and welcome to our 2022 Hayward Lectures. Our lecturer this evening, as you know, if you've seen any of the things online, is Dr. Jeannine Brown. She's the David Price Professor of Biblical and Theological Foundations at Bethel Seminary, where she's taught for 20-some years. She has her BA, or Bachelor of Music, from the University of Wisconsin in Eau Claire. She has her Master of Divinity from Bethel Seminary, where she's teaching, and she has her PhD from Luther Seminary. She teaches in the areas of New Testament Greek, hermeneutics, and integration. And it's the last bit that I want to focus on for this introduction this evening. You may have seen in her bibliography, if you look at the institutional site more than if you look at what we have, that she has worked on 2 volumes that have to do with integration in some way. Relational integration of psychology and Christian theology, theory, research, and practice, which she did with Steve Sandage. And that's not the normal kind of fare for New Testament scholars, I might add. That was 2018. Back in 2011, she wrote Becoming Whole and Holy, an Integrative Conversation about Christian Formation. Well, I'm going to pair that with someone else. She's married to Tim Brown, who is a singer and songwriter. And they met because of their music and because of their love of a certain group of novels and a certain novelist. I said earlier that Jeannine has her first degree as a Bachelor of Music. That's how it's listed. She informed me today that it's actually a Bachelor of Music Therapy. And so her interest in integrating the whole person and bringing her biblical studies and theological foundations into an understanding of the whole person has been developing over her whole academic career. So before I ask her to come, just a couple of housekeeping matters. Oh, I should say it's wonderful to have you with us, and we welcome you to Acadia Divinity College and here. Tomorrow morning at 11:15, the chapel, and Dr. Brown is our speaker, will be here at Acadia Divinity College. And over many years, we have gone down to the Manning Chapel. This year, it will be here in our chapel. If you have registered online, you will have received a link for tomorrow's chapel service if you want to watch it online. If you want to participate and worship together with us, then register if you have not done that already. So we invite you to do that. And those of you who are online, tonight it will be you who gets pride of place for the questioning. Last night it was those who were here. Tonight we will begin with you who are online. So please be thinking of your questions and texting them or putting them into the comments sections of the various social media. And those will be compiled, and I will choose from those for our question and response time. So tonight our lecture is titled Matthew and Jesus Riddles, Is Jesus a Messiah of Riddles? And we invite Dr. Brown to come and give us her lecture.
It's good to be with you again this evening. We're in my home territory of Matthew, so I just need to say this is the gospel in which I did my dissertation and have written commentaries, and it's kind of nice to be on home turf this evening for my lecture. So riddles are told for fun, at least in my cultural context. A riddle I often heard growing up was, what is white and black and red all over? Is this also a Canadian riddle? Does it also work in Canada? Okay, what do we have? Newspaper, right. Here's another one. I'm tall when I'm young and I'm short when I'm old. What am I? Oh, Luke, you can say it louder. A candle, right. That one wasn't as familiar in my growing up years. For some reason, that first one was all we ever did with riddles, I think. Now, it probably goes without saying that riddles are very often, and most often really, culturally specific. At least in my Western, U.S. context, there's not much at stake in telling and answering of riddles. Their goal is entertainment, the pleasure you feel when you get it right. There's not much at stake in not guessing the right answer to a riddle. But consider this. Folklorists have identified what are called neck riddles, a type of riddle that requires a person to use their wits to answer a riddle in order to elude danger, to save their neck. With a neck riddle, stakes are high, very high. And in the first century world in which Jesus lived, riddles often had higher stakes than we might initially suspect. At stake in the making and answering of riddles are things like honor and shame, a demonstration of superior wisdom, and sometimes life and death. It's no coincidence that Jesus engages with the Jerusalem leaders in a contest of riddles in Matthew 21 through 22, just days before his execution at their instigation. Tonight we'll be addressing the questions, what does Matthew portray Jesus as a Messiah who riddles? And if so, how does this help us to interpret the Gospel of Matthew? Now, Matthew's Gospel has quite an array of embedded genres, various forms that populate this writing that, at its heart, is a biography of Jesus. Matthew, as a biographer, incorporates his own diverse set of subgenres, including an opening genealogy, quite a number of scripture fulfillment quotations, and various other narrative forms that were defined in specific ways by form critics of a previous era, such as pronouncement stories and controversies. But the greatest number of embedded genres occur within the teachings of Jesus in Matthew, illuminating the diversity of forms that Jesus used as he communicated the good news of the kingdom in his public ministry. Robert Stein, a mentor of mine, identifies quite a variety of teaching forms that Jesus used, including parable, poetry, proverb, hyperbole, metaphor, pun, and riddle. My goal tonight is to tap into that last category, the riddle, to see if Matthew portrays Jesus using riddles, and even using riddles routinely. To put it more provocatively, in Matthew, is Jesus a Messiah of riddles? I will suggest and attempt to demonstrate that Matthew's Jesus often does use riddles to teach about the arriving kingdom, about his own identity, and about discipleship, as well as to evade tests and tricks set up for him by his opponents. But why? Why look for riddles? Why, of all the subgenres Matthew employs, did I choose to explore riddles? I suppose the primary reason is that riddles are not often the subject of interpretive conversations in the Gospels. We could say that, generally speaking, they are under-identified and so under-interpreted. It's common enough to hear affirmed that Jesus' teachings were not always easy to understand, but the fault for this is usually placed at the feet of the hearers. The problem is those dull and obdurate disciples. Or we blame the religious and political leaders Jesus comes in contact with for their inability to grasp what we can plainly see, who Jesus is and what he's up to. But what if at least sometimes Jesus was intentionally ambiguous? As we soon will see, intentional ambiguity is at the heart of what a riddle is. If Jesus, at least some of the time, communicated cryptically by design, this would help to explain the many different types of responses to him. Now, the notion that some of Jesus' teachings have some amount of ambiguity is not a new thing in gospel studies, especially as Jesus used such a variety of teaching forms. A parable can be ambiguous. Hyperbole can be ambiguous. A pun can be ambiguous. Metaphor can be ambiguous. But a riddle is something different. Few other teaching forms are, by definition, ambiguous. No other teaching form is, I think, at the heart of it, deliberately ambiguous. It's my contention that the use of riddles by Jesus has not been adequately explored. It is true that many gospel scholars give a general nod to the presence of riddles within the teachings of Jesus, many times within the list of the varieties of kinds of material that he used to teach. For example, a half-century ago, Jeremias noted that, unlike other teachers of his time, there were a considerable number of riddles in Jesus' teachings. Yet, to my knowledge, the only scholar to dive deeply into the possibility of riddles in Jesus' teachings and the interpretive implications is a scholar named Tom Thatcher. First, he explored riddles in his dissertation in John's Gospel, and then he has a study of riddles in all four Gospels called Jesus the Riddler. I suspect that the dearth of scholarship on this topic contributes to an under-identification of riddles in the Gospels. Another reason riddles are under-identified involves the lack of clear formal indicators for many riddles. As Tom Thatcher puts it, the things that make a statement a riddle are not always things that you can see or hear in the statement itself. What defines a riddle as riddle has significant cultural parameters, and in many contexts is tied less to formal than to functional qualities. In other words, what a riddle does to and for its speakers and hearers. Those of us, at least from Western contexts, will need to think beyond the narrow category of riddle with its usual setup using what is X or what has Y, that kind of language. We'll also need to disabuse ourselves of the idea that riddles are all fun and games, puzzles told primarily or exclusively for their entertainment value. Yet the reality that riddles can lack formal indicators, or at least have a minimal amount of formal indication, means we could fall in the trap of finding a riddle under every rock. If riddles are ambiguous, this doesn't mean that every point of ambiguity within Jesus' teachings proves that he is at that point speaking a riddle. We'll need some criteria for determining riddles in the Gospels, something Thatcher provides for us in his own work. And I'll add some of my own parameters for discerning riddles in Matthew. In the end, identifying whether something in Jesus' teaching is a riddle has interpretive significance. This is a key reason I've been intrigued by this subgenre in Matthew. I have found that identifying riddles in Matthew makes a difference for the interpretation of the riddle and at times the larger section of which it is a part. And by the end of the evening, I will suggest some reasons why Matthew's Jesus riddles as he does. As we move to define and identify riddles in Matthew, it can be helpful to place Jesus' riddles within their wider context by looking to the Jewish scriptures. In the Hebrew Bible, riddles fit within the larger category of mashal, an umbrella term that, as Dick France notes, covers proverbs, fables, prophetic utterances, and even riddles, as well as allegorical parables like those in Ezekiel. The Greek word parabole essentially covers the same ground as mashal. In fact, the Hebrew mashal is typically translated by the Greek parabole in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. So parabole has a wider referent than what we think of when we hear the English word parable, even though it's sort of an exact replication of it, right? It sounds the same. This is true for Matthew's use of parabole, which sometimes identifies a saying, even a riddle, rather than a story. With this lexical information in mind, let's consider what riddles are and how we might identify them. Thatcher describes riddles as confusing on purpose. That's my favorite definition of riddles. He does have a longer one, though, and his definition in this case highlights intentional ambiguity and focuses on the multiple potential referents of a riddle. He writes, "A riddle is an interrogative statement that intentionally obscures its referent, that is the thing or idea it is talking about, and asks the audience to name it. Riddles obscure their reference through controlled ambiguity, the artful use of language that could reasonably refer to more than one thing." To return to a shorter definition, James Crenshaw describes a riddle as a saying that both puzzles the hearers and communicates to them. What these definitions have in common is the theme of ambiguity. The newspaper riddle I grew up hearing was one that works only as a spoken riddle. You can't make it in writing and make it a riddle. What is black and white and red all over? A newspaper. The ambiguity of this riddle is the use of red, which, given the two already mentioned colors, is likely to be heard initially as a color, the color red. Only upon hearing the answer or knowing it from previous tellings does the hearer understand that they should hear red, the act of reading past tense, instead of the color. This artful use of language, plays on these different referents to make its riddle work. Let's take an example of a riddling question from Matthew's Gospel. After Jesus bestows forgiveness on a man who is paralyzed in Matthew 9, his antagonists accuse him of blasphemy. Then Jesus asks a question that seems to be a riddle. What is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise and walk? Both questions can provide the right answer to which is easier to say, something commentators routinely note. Presumably in an era where healers were plentiful enough, healing was an easier feat than granting forgiveness, since only God can forgive. The scribes in the story clearly feel this issue as they accuse Jesus of blasphemy for even saying he can forgive. Yet it would be easier to say, that is to pronounce forgiveness, than to enact healing, since verification of a healing would immediately be obvious or not. Rodney Reeves, who identifies this saying as a riddle, notes, quote, it is much easier to say your sins are forgiven, since who can tell if it's true, end quote. Yet riddles are not necessarily formal questions. Thatcher's definition highlights a riddle as an interrogative statement. This point of nuance means that riddles have the quality of a question without necessarily involving the formal feature of an interrogative. In other words, it doesn't have to be shaped like a question or in a question. As anthropologist Ellie Kangas Miranda notes, the riddle image is always conceptually a question, be it syntactically interrogative or not. In Matthew, a riddle that doesn't explicitly offer a question can be found in Matthew 22:21. In response to a trick question about whether it is right to pay the imperial tax, the Roman tax, in 22:15, Jesus poses a riddle. After pressing his antagonist to produce the appropriate coin and to identify whose image and inscription are on the coin, Jesus says this: give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. Routinely, commentators refer to this saying as cryptic, oblique, or as Ben Witherington puts it, deliberately ambiguous. It is then, I think, a riddle. Although this saying is not a question grammatically, it functions interrogatively, since the hearer is required to sort out what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. In fact, the ambiguity of these two reference, ta kaiseros, what belongs to Caesar, and ta to theou, what belongs to God, it's that ambiguity that puts this aphorism squarely in the category of a riddle. Additionally, Thatcher's observation that riddles play with the audience's sense of order and values is on full display in this particular saying, since Jesus is questioning any neat division between what is Caesar's and what is God's. More on this soon, but for now I want you to note that, strictly speaking, the form of a question is not a requirement for a riddle. So we know this much so far. Riddles are intentionally ambiguous statements or questions, but always with an interrogative sense to them. How do we go about identifying riddles in a larger work like the narrative of Matthew? In other words, how do we locate riddles as an embedded genre? If we think a saying or a riddle or a question is a riddle, is there a way to confirm or authenticate that identification? Thatcher helps us again by providing a set of potential criteria for identifying riddles. I've adapted these to some extent based on my own analysis of riddles in Matthew. The first two criteria arise directly from the definition of riddles, namely their ambiguity and their interrogative sense. First, we may be hearing a riddle if an ambiguity in the saying can be adequately clarified or solved by multiple reference. As we saw in Matthew 9:5, the easier thing to say could be alternatively construed as proclaiming healing or announcing sins forgiven. Both alternatives are possible, and so Jesus could be offering a riddle. Second, we may be hearing a riddle if the line is framed directly as a question, as in Matthew 9:5, or it has an interrogative sense to it. In other words, it leaves to the audience to resolve the dilemma. We hear this interrogative flavor, though not form, in Matthew 22:21. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. Since Jesus sets an implicit choice before his audience. These two criteria help us along toward identifying a riddle without yet having a narrative context to aid and assist. But fortunately, in Matthew, we do have a context, so we can look for a number of narrative clues to confirm we are dealing with a riddle. First, the gospel writer often can provide their own cues to signal a riddle, so looking for narrator cues can help us identify riddles. Thatcher offers the extended example of a narrative aside from John's gospel, from chapter 10, where the author writes, Jesus used this figure of speech, and here it is in context the image of a good shepherd. But the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Most of the time, though, we don't have this kind of extended clue that we are seeing or hearing a riddle. In Matthew, narrative clues frequently involve just a single word. For example, Matthew uses the word pagideuo at 22:15 to indicate the intention of certain Jewish leaders to trap Jesus by offering a trick question. It's not surprising then that Jesus uses a riddle, in this case the Caesar-God riddle, to elude their trap. A narrator can also signal the presence of riddles by framing a section of text as a riddling session, an extended set of questions, tests, and contests in which riddles play a central role. I'll suggest in a moment that much of Matthew 21 through 22 is a riddling session, and we'll spend some time walking through this extended set of vignettes to highlight where and how riddles are used. For the time being, I'll note that Matthew as narrator gives multiple subtle clues in this passage that it is a riddling session, including his choice of language for how various groups of Jewish leaders approach and interact with Jesus. Another point of confirmation that a riddle is being used comes from speakers themselves, and for our purposes, indications Jesus gives that he is riddling. While not all questions Jesus asks are riddles, and not all riddles are shaped in the form of a question, making particular note of questions can be fertile ground for identifying potential riddles. It's a good starting point, at least. Additionally, Thatcher notes that riddles are sometimes introduced by stock questions and phrases, like the introductory question, "What do you think?" which Matthew uses a number of times, and the aphorism, "The one who has ears ought to listen." Both of these are Jesus' words in Matthew's gospel. And both of these also could be augmented by the call by the Matthean Jesus to listen and understand. This could also be a clue that a riddle is being used. Other speaker clues include providing an indirect answer to a question posed, or even deferring an answer to a question. In Matthew 21:23 through 27, for example, Jesus avoids answering a question by his adversaries by refusing to answer their question unless they answer his question first. A final lens for confirming a riddle comes from the audience in the story. If narrative characters respond to a saying or a question with some amount of confusion or amazement, it may well be that they are reacting to a riddle. Let's take an example from Matthew 15. Jesus responds to a question by some Pharisees and scribes about his disciples not participating in purity washings by giving this aphorism: "It is not what enters the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person." The disciples report to Jesus that the Jewish leaders stumble over the aphorism Jesus has spoken. And the disciples themselves are confused by what Jesus has said, so that Peter needs to ask for an explanation of this parabole, as Matthew refers to this saying. 15:15. These responses suggest that Jesus has told a riddle. We can note similar confusion on the part of the disciples in Matthew 16, where Jesus warns them of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They are bewildered and think Jesus is speaking about physical bread, while he is warning them about the influence or the teaching of these Jewish leaders. Their confusion might point to Jesus having used a riddle. A riddle involves a match of wits in which the individual is challenged to discover the concealed meaning of the riddle. In this match of wits, the riddler wins if the riddlee can't answer. When the match of wits is extended to include more than a single riddle, we can identify the prolonged contest as a riddling session. Roger Abrams and Alan Dundees, in their study of riddles in various cultures, describe riddling sessions as special occasions during which riddles are used in a properly playful contest situation. While in some social contexts, riddles are used, as these authors note, in playful ways, in other cultural contexts, riddling sessions raise high stakes of honor and shame, as already noted. This is true of the first century social context in which Matthew writes, which is often described as an agonistic society. Jerome Nere defines agonistic society by its intensely competitive nature. Such competition shows up in the regular public challenges put to Jesus throughout his career. The stakes for riddling are high in Matthew because first century society attributed great value to riddles and riddling. The engagement between Jesus and various groups of leaders in Matthew 21 through 22 offers an extended riddling session in which questions, tests, and contests predominate and where riddles play a central role. A riddling session begins in Matthew 21:23 with the question posed to Jesus about the source of his authority, and the session runs through the end of the chapter where Jesus finally, I'm going to go back one just to hang out there for a bit, where Jesus finally provides his answer to that initial question. Across this riddling session, we'll run into various riddle criteria. Intentional ambiguity on Jesus' part that presses his hearers to make a choice. Additional cues from narrator, the speaker, and the hearers that indicate a riddle is occurring. Matthew portrays Jesus in this section as the wise sage who can both answer and elude verbal traps set for him. As W.D. Davies and Dale Allison describe it, Jesus' answers to his opponents across this section, they would describe his answers as uniformly creative and clever, memorable and colorful, and they avoid entanglement either by turning a question back on others or moving the discussion to another level. So let's look at this riddling session. First, the framework. After Jesus enters Jerusalem in messianic fashion and interrupts the commerce happening in the temple, 21:1 through 17, the Jewish elders and chief priests question his authority for these actions. By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? They ask. When Jesus defers answering their question, a riddling session is set in motion that runs across the rest of chapters 21 through 22. Various groups of Jewish leaders bring questions and tests to Jesus, and he, at every turn, bests them at their own game. In the end, Jesus asks the final question and poses a riddle that silences them all. Matthean scholars line up to agree that Matthew 22:45 is a riddle. Here's the text. Jesus says, how does David by the Spirit call the Messiah Lord when he says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet? So if David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? The riddle posed by Jesus answers the initial question in 21:23 about the source of his authority. The answer? He is the highest authority. He is Lord even over his ancestor David. Together, the initial question and final answer frame the entire riddling session. Now, between the initial question challenging Jesus' authority and his riddle that finally answers that question, there's an extended riddling session. We walk through 21:23 through 22:46 with an eye to the riddles that fuel the competing claims for authority between Jesus and the Jewish Jerusalem leaders. When asked about the source of his authority by the chief priests and elders, Jesus answers with a question of his own. As Donald Hagner notes, their questions are an attempt to gain more ammunition to be used against Jesus when the time is right. Jesus' rejoinder sets up a binary with two opposite answers possible. He says, I will also ask you a question. If you answer it for me, then I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. Where did John's baptism come from? From heaven or from humans? The question Jesus asks is a catch-22 for the Jerusalem leaders, and it moves the focus away from Jesus to John the Baptist. Notice how he did that? It's pretty smart. If they answer that John's baptism came from God, then they indict themselves for not believing John's message. If they answer in the negative, they lose favor with the crowds who consider John to be a prophet, 21:26. So they avoid answering altogether and respond, we don't know. Jesus has already bested them at the game of questioning by avoiding answering their questions intended to trap him, at least for the time being. The riddling session is initiated with a set of questions lobbed back and forth with no one getting or giving a direct answer. There are no riddles as of yet, but the contest of wits has begun, with Jesus successfully eluding the initial trap. Jesus goes on the offensive at this point and takes charge of the dialogue. Conventionally, the next three pericopes are identified as story parables: the parables of the two sons, the parable of the vineyard, the parable of the wedding feast. And Matthew indicates that each of these should be understood as a parabole, 21:33, 22:1. Yet, as we have seen, a parabole should not simply be defined by the more narrow English word parable, in other words, stories told to impact an audience. Instead, parabole can refer to an array of forms, including a riddle. Hermeneutically important for this first parabole is its introductory question, what do you think? Which, as we've seen, can signal a riddle. This potential riddle consists of a scenario culminating in a binary question. Jesus said, a man had two sons. He came to the first and said, my son, go and work in my vineyard today. The son replied, I do not want to go. But later he changed his mind and went out. The father came to the other son and said the same thing. That son replied, I will go, sir, but he did not. Which of the two did the will of the father? On the face of it, this question seems to have an easy answer, which the Jewish leaders provide. The first, they reply. The first son, who in the end does what his father asks, certainly does fit a quintessentially Matthean theme of doing the will of the father. Ta thelemata ta tu patras. We can also note that in Jesus' follow-up accusation, his opponents act in opposite fashion to the first son, who has a change of mind and so obeys his father. Jesus accuses them, you did not change your minds and come to believe John. Yet there is ambiguity in the question, which of the two did the will of the father, since the first son initially defies his father's request, a culturally unacceptable action in that social context, and potentially a cause for shame and disgrace. Listen to the Jewish writing Sirach, written in the 2nd century before the Common Era, about this topic. Honor your father by word and deed, that his blessing may come upon you. And in Matthew, congruence between words and deeds has already been signaled as an important discipleship value. Chapter 12, by your words you will be vindicated, and by your words you will be condemned. Teasing out the inherent ambiguity of the question, which did the will of their father, both sons can be viewed as partially disobedient. As Kevin Barker puts it, disobedience intermingled with obedience is still disobedience in some measure. The ideal response would be a yes response in both word and deed, which neither son provides. Yet this ideal both and obedience is the ultimate point of the passage. Given the disobedience in some measure of both sons, the question Jesus asks could be a riddle. The riddle-like quality of this parabole is further supported by the text-critical jumble it produced after its composition. One relevant text-critical issue has to do with how the Jewish leaders answer the question about which son did their father's will. The manuscript evidence suggests the original answer was the first, ha protos, yet some scribes substituted the last, ha eschatos, potentially because of the dishonor that would have been perceived to attend the first son's initial refusal to obey his father. Just a thought. To recap so far, the riddling session began with a question in 21:23, a challenge by the Jerusalem leadership to Jesus' perceived messianic actions as he entered Jerusalem and the temple. Jesus responded with his own question for these leaders, which captured his questioners in a quandary. Now Jesus has given them a riddle to indict them for their rejection of John's message. This riddling session is winding up to be, as Rodney Reeves puts it, the ultimate turf war. Matthew narrates Jesus confronting the Jewish leaders with two more parabolae, the parable of the vineyard and the parable of the wedding feast. These both story parables, both indicting these leaders for their rejection of Jesus as son. While neither of these parabolae are themselves riddles, there is at least one riddle used within them. After telling the first of these two parables, Jesus cites Psalm 118, 22 through 23 in Matthew 21:42. He then indicates that the kingdom will be taken out of the hands of the Jewish leadership for the rejection of the Son, 21:43. Now comes the riddle. The one who falls on this stone will be dashed to pieces, and the one on whom it falls will be crushed. This saying is just elusive enough to fit the categorization of riddle with its open-ended personal references. The one, who is Jesus referring to with that? And the use of a rather obscure final verb, likmao, crush, or something like that. And a look at Matthean commentaries shows that this is a difficult saying to interpret. There's not a lot of agreement here. So a possible riddle in the midst of these two parables. Jesus has told three parabolae in a row to incriminate the Jewish leadership, identified as the chief priests, elders of the people, and Pharisees, for their rejection of his messianic authority. Now the leaders go on the offensive, as they have attempted to do in their initial question. Three groups, each in turn, come to Jesus with trick questions intending to trap him by the answers he gives. And this gets us to the heart of the riddling session, in my view. The first question comes from an unlikely alliance between Pharisees and Herodians. These leaders, who likely held opposing views on the question of paying Roman taxes, asked Jesus if it is lawful to pay the imperial tax to Caesar. Their question seems intended as a catch-22, since answering yes or no would alienate some part of the social landscape in first century Judaism. In fact, Thatcher categorizes the question itself as a riddle. If Jesus responds by suggesting that paying the imperial tax is something a faithful Jewish person ought to do, he risks alienating all those sympathetic to revolutionary currents against Roman occupation. If he answers otherwise, he himself could be pegged as a revolutionary and a threat to Rome. But Jesus is not so easily fooled. He doesn't answer with a clear yes or no. Instead, he performs a riddle. First, Jesus asks his opponents to produce a denarius, which is the cost of the temple or the Roman tax, the tax to Caesar, and to confirm whose image and inscription are on the coin. Then Jesus tells them to give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. Although framed as a neat and tidy binary between the realm of Caesar and the realm of God, the reality is far more complicated. Intentional ambiguity signals that this saying is a riddle. First, an important Jewish conviction affirms that all things belong to God. Think, for example, of Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. On the Roman side of things, Caesar's claims were also all-encompassing. This would have been very much visible on the denarius Jesus and his inquisitors were viewing, which read on one side, in Latin, Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus, and on the other side, high priest, to describe Caesar. Both Yahweh and Caesar claim the whole territory of the whole earth. Through his riddle, Jesus can implicitly assert Yahweh's universal rule in the face of Rome's claims to sovereignty, yet avoid falling into his opponent's trap by directly forbidding payment of the imperial tax. If you remember, one of the corroborating criteria for identifying riddles is the audience's confused or bewildered response. In Matthew 22, we hear that Jesus' opponents are amazed. This response suggests that, at a minimum, they are impressed with his capacity to evade their trap. But viewed more broadly, I think it implies that they experience some amount of bewilderment at Jesus' words. Matthew has framed the entire pericope to hint at the riddle Jesus tells within it, from the laying of the trap for Jesus in 22:15 to the amazement of the trappers in the end, verse 22. Matthew ties the next contest of wits closely with the one about the imperial tax. He uses a temporal marker that same day and notes that another group within the Jerusalem leadership comes with a question. The Sadducees provide what they think is a ridiculous scenario to show how preposterous belief in resurrection is, since this group did not hold to belief in resurrection. Both David Garland and David Turner identify the entire scenario as a riddle, from the hypothetical vignette of a woman married successively to 7 brothers, they each die, as you might remember, to its concluding question about whose wife will she be in the resurrection. After seeing another set of leaders bested by the riddling Jesus, these Sadducees bring a riddle of their own to him. Their question, whose wife at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, verse 28, is meant to reveal an absurdity, signaling that a wife with 7 resurrected husbands provides an insurmountable obstacle to the whole idea of resurrection. Yet Jesus is not baffled by this riddle, although he doesn't directly answer the question, whose wife will she be? Instead, he goes on the offensive once again and points out their fundamental error regarding resurrection. He accuses, you are deceived because you don't know either the scriptures or God's power. Quite an indictment on 2 fronts. He then corrects these Sadducees about the nature of final resurrection, its basis in the Torah, and the very God they claim to trust. As David Garland puts it, the Sadducees have, in the end, underestimated God himself. As Jesus outwits his opponents once again, Matthew indicates that the crowds who have been listening in are amazed at his teaching. Again, we can look to audience response to confirm that we are hearing a riddle. The next line of attack by the Jerusalem leadership comes from a Pharisee, described as a Torah expert, who is commissioned when the Pharisees hear that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees. This introduction to the final of 3 questions lobbed at Jesus emphasizes 3 realities about this riddling session, especially this part in 22:15 and following. First, the three questions are asked to test or trap Jesus. The imperial tax question was intended as a trap, pagaduo, and then later parazzo, used in that passage. The Sadducees asked Jesus a riddle meant to make his view of resurrection look ridiculous, and now this Torah expert is out to test him. Parazzo is used again here in verse 35. Notice also that each question is framed as a Torah question. From is it lawful in 22:17 to the Sadducees' question surrounding the Torah-prescribed Levirate marriage in 22:24 to the question of the greatest commandment in the Torah in the passage we're about to look at. Jesus' reputation as a legitimate teacher of the law has been on the line in each case. A final point. It's worth noting that going on the offensive against Jesus has created some strange bedfellows among the Jerusalem Jewish leaders. Jesus offends the chief priests and scribes with his actions in the temple, 21:15, and it is the chief priests and elders of the people who bring the initial question to Jesus about his authority for his action, 21:23. After Jesus' initial two parabolae, the chief priests and Pharisees know he is referring to them. They recognize that they are the ones indicted. Then, in quick succession, three groups approached Jesus to trick him. Pharisees, along with Herodians, Sadducees, and Pharisees once again. These different groups have distinct loyalties and views. They disagree on much, but they come with a united front to catch Jesus in his words. In the final test, the delegated Pharisee asks Jesus for his understanding of the greatest commandment in the law. While Matthew indicates that the query is meant to test Jesus, this question on its surface isn't as obviously a trap. Gary Burge suggests Jesus is presented with a classic dilemma of law. Surely not all laws could be equally important. Some must be weighty, others light. Burge goes on to note that the danger in this sort of moral speculation is that it creates an ethical hierarchy weighing the slightest details of religious behavior. As we see Jesus addressing this, and we see that Jesus addressing this kind of problem of prioritization head on in Matthew 23:23. Speaking to scribes and Pharisees, Jesus warns, "For you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and loyalty. These you should have done without neglecting the others." So while the question appears less threatening than the previous two, these Pharisees are apparently hoping that Jesus' answer will show him to be idiosyncratic enough to raise suspicions about his Torah interpretation. Jesus answers by bringing together two Torah commands, to love God and to love neighbor. Then he concludes, "On these two commandments hang the entire law and prophets." None of the language or the ideas Jesus expresses are unique within his Jewish context. In this way, Jesus aligns himself with the Hebrew scriptures and faithful interpretation of them. His hermeneutics centered on love of God and neighbor is no threat to his faith or his people. But his hermeneutic does call for a singular loyalty to Israel's God that makes a claim on the whole person. In the final episode of this riddling session, first initiated by the Jerusalem leaders, Matthew shows Jesus having the last word. And his final word is a riddle. They have been throwing riddles at him all day. Now it is their turn to answer one. That's Reeves' language. Of all the riddles I have proposed in this section of Matthew, this one is by far the most agreed upon riddle in the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus begins his final confrontation with the question, "What do you think?" We've already noted that this question can signal that a riddle is coming. The riddle centers on the identity of the Messiah. What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? The Pharisees answer that the Messiah is David's son, and an answer that is accurate as far as it goes, and which fits Matthew's son of David Christology. But Jesus confounds that straightforward answer with a riddle constructed from Psalm 110:1. He riddles, then how does David, by the Spirit, call him, the Messiah, Lord, when he says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet"? So if David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? That last question is the heart of the riddle. If David calls him Lord, how can he be David's son? The right answer to this riddle is to avoid choosing one identity over the other. The answer is that the Messiah standing in front of them is both Son of David and Lord of David. As Reeves puts it, Jesus is the answer to the riddle. The lordship of Jesus has been hinted at in Matthew already by Jesus himself and by others at a number of points. Here it is made clear through the psalm reference that his lordship is tied to his exaltation by God to ultimate kingship, a reality that will be affirmed at the conclusion of Matthew in Jesus' own claim to possess all authority in heaven and on earth. The riddle that Jesus speaks provides a cryptic answer to the question that began the riddling session at 21:23. By what authority are you doing these things? Answer: Jesus is both Messiah and Lord, authorized by Israel's God in all he does. Israel's leaders, who assumed they started the riddling session with the upper hand, are now unable to respond. As the final verse of chapter 22 makes clear, no one was able to say a word in answer to his question, and from that day on, no one dared to question him any longer. Jesus' wisdom, employed through questions, riddles, and even evasive tactics when his neck is on the line, quashes his opponent's tests and traps, in the end, leaving them speechless. To sum up, Matthew 21:23 through 22:46, I think, is a riddling session. I've suggested this genre identification by the sheer number of statements and questions that foster intentional ambiguity. We also have seen confirmation of riddles across these two chapters through a variety of means. First, clues from the narrator, including mentioning of traps and tests. Second, clues from the various characters as they ask ambiguous questions of Jesus, and Jesus responds with his own questions. And third, responses from the various character audiences, including utter amazement from both crowds and leaders, and in the final turn, absolute silence. We now turn to the question of the difference it makes to identify riddles in Matthew. Once we've noticed the presence of riddles in even an entire riddling session, what should that do for our interpretive practices and conclusions as we read and study Matthew? I'd like us to consider the hermeneutical significance first for understanding what Jesus teaches, and then for understanding Jesus himself. The first interpretive implication of the regular presence of riddles in Jesus' teachings is to adjust our assumptions about how transparent Jesus is at every turn. If riddles are, by definition, intentionally ambiguous, then Jesus, if we grant that he used riddles, was not always fully transparent as he taught. At times, Jesus intended to be ambiguous. To repeat what I said earlier, I don't think there is a riddle under every Matthean rock. Riddles are most effective when employed for particular purposes in specific contexts. And plenty of Jesus' teachings in Matthew are unambiguous in their meaning. Matthew 5:44 comes to mind, where Jesus exhorts his followers to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. What Jesus expects might be difficult to live out, but it's not particularly hard to understand. But if Jesus' teachings were sometimes intentionally ambiguous, readers of Matthew will want to be attentive to the multiple possible reference or meanings embedded in a riddle. We will want to shift our genre expectation as we encounter these riddles. When we come upon what looks to be a riddle by the criteria we've outlined, a first move is to slow down our reading and shift our interpretive frame to look for and press into the ambiguity. Knowing that multiple references are likely within a riddle, we should sketch out various possibilities and consider which might be in view. And it can be more than one. So we'll want to realize that the most obvious answer may not be the one intended. we should also be careful to think beyond binaries that riddles sometimes set up and which they often mean to question. Ben Witherington highlights the need for a thoughtful reading strategy when he talks about wisdom literature more generally, but he does mention riddles particularly. He writes, "Wisdom literature requires patience and time. Since so much of wisdom literature involves indirect speech, metaphors, similes, figures, images, and riddles, rather than straightforward propositions or normal discourse, one is obliged not merely to read the wisdom material, but also to ruminate upon it." So I would suggest hermeneutically, riddles require rumination. They invite us to ponder longer than expected. Let's try this out on another potential Matthean riddle. Jesus twice gives the following aphorism to his disciples: "Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for me will find it." 10:39, but also 16:25. Davies and Allison in their commentary suggest this could well be a riddle. It does fit the definition of a riddle in that the reference are ambiguous. Between the first and second clauses, Jesus uses finds, heurisco, and loses, apolumi, in two different ways, as well as life, psyche, with two distinct meanings. Life, psyche in Greek, can be one's present temporal existence or one's eschatological eternal existence with God. The riddle plays on each of these three words to mean more than one thing in close context. Such word plays create ambiguity and invite rumination. Upon reflection, to find one's life in the first clause has to do with attempts to find life on one's own, apart from Jesus. But finding life in the second clause is granted because of losing one's life for Jesus. Ulrich Lutz interprets this to mean that true life is not what human beings acquire for themselves, but what God will grant precisely through death. The riddle functions as a promise for those who, for Jesus' sake, surrender their life. I think there's deep paradox here. Maybe a riddle. Yet the paradox that sits at the center of this saying or this riddle can be masked by our sheer familiarity with it. This is such a common line. We probably all know it by heart. We know this one and so many other sayings of Jesus that we have potentially normalized them to sound self-evident. It can help our hermeneutical approach to consider how such riddles would have landed on the ears of the first hearers of Jesus, who may have been more than a little befuddled by his word plays about life and death at a point in his ministry where it's far from clear that his messianic mission would reach its zenith on a Roman cross. An important caveat. The presence of riddles across Jesus' teachings is not an argument for a Gnostic portrait of Jesus or what he teaches. The teachings of Jesus aren't aimed at a chosen few and obscure to all the rest, a view that later Gnostic Christian writers would promote. Instead, in the Gospels and in Matthew specifically, Jesus' invitation to listen and understand is a real invitation, even if it points to the need for open and receptive listening and continued rumination for understanding to occur. The one who has ears ought to listen, Jesus says. What we can say about at least some of Jesus' teachings in the Gospels, and in Matthew particularly, is that they confound before they illuminate. And they often confound the disciples who follow Jesus as well as his opponents. Yet Matthew expects that his audience, believers who know and understand Jesus to be the crucified and risen Messiah, will understand Jesus' teachings as he communicates them, riddles and all. In fact, those who struggle to understand what Jesus is saying at any particular part of the storyline function as a kind of foil for Matthew's readers who are meant to comprehend what the story characters often struggle to understand. I'd like to conclude by considering the Christological implications of the Matthean Jesus as one who tells riddles and tells them with some frequency. We can begin with Ben Witherington's observation that riddles, along with other teaching forms, were handed down within the early church, at least in part because they were believed to say something about Jesus. So what does Matthew say about this Jesus who sometimes speaks in riddles? First, the ability of Jesus to outwit leaders who confront him and try to trap him shows that Jesus is wise beyond the rest. While Matthew affirms many roles for Jesus, prophet, teacher, Messiah, as just a few, he also accents Jesus as sage. Matthew does so mostly implicitly through Jesus' capacity to evade the traps set for him through wise responses or sometimes non-answers. He astonishes those listening to him by his wisdom. For example, people of his hometown wonder about the source of his wisdom. Where did this one gain such wisdom and power to do miracles? We also see Jesus as sage in his extensive teaching in Matthew's gospel that draws from the Jewish scriptures in both form and content and announces and explains the arriving reign of God. Yet Matthew casts Jesus not only as the wisest of Jewish teachers, he also implies that Jesus is the very embodiment of wisdom. In Matthew 11, the evangelist implicitly but clearly indicates that Jesus should be understood as wisdom. First, Matthew frames 11:2-19 with an inclusio, or a bookend, aligning the Messiah's deeds, 11:2, ta erga, to Christu, with the deeds of wisdom, ta erga, with Sophia as its referent. Additionally, at the end of Matthew 11, Jesus offers an invitation that sounds very much like wisdom's invitation in Proverbs and other Jewish wisdom books like Sirach. Matthew's Jesus invites, "Come to me, all who are weary and weighed down, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my load is light." Given these wisdom echoes and the previous deeds of the Messiah, deeds of wisdom, inclusio, when Jesus invites the weary to come to him, it is God's wisdom speaking. We began the evening wondering around the question, does Matthew portray Jesus as a Messiah of riddles? I've answered that question as best I can in the affirmative, showing how Jesus in Matthew outwits and sometimes confounds his opponents and even confuses his followers at times as he expresses divine wisdom. Jesus is the wisest of all teachers. Yet Matthew doesn't stop there. He shows Jesus as Riddler to demonstrate that Jesus is the very embodiment of divine wisdom. God's ways are not always immediately discernible. So Matthew's Jesus invites those who would follow him to listen intently to his words. The one who has ears ought to listen. And this Jesus invites all who would follow him to learn from him. 11:29. For Matthew's readers, both ancient and present day, the invitation is to follow this Jesus who is wisdom in the flesh. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Is there enough Old Testament in there?
There's enough Old
There's a
Testament.
lot of
Just
Old Testament
just
there.
mention Mashal. You're good.
Yes. Yeah,
Yes.
I figured just one Hebrew word would do it. Okay.
Well, I will begin with the question, which is about a specific passage, and we'll wait for more questions to come in online, and then we'll open it up here. When Jesus is quizzed by Pilate, "Are you king of the Jews?" he answers, "Su leges," which really is not an answer. Do you think, is that Jesus doing what you're talking about here? Is he giving this kind of an answer that you can take it one way or the other?
I think so, yes. I think it's quite cryptic. And he does that 3 times, up in the upper room discourse as well, similar language. And so when he says, "So you say," or it's hard in English to kind of capture that the brevity and maybe the ambiguity then. Maybe so. I mean, you have to take a lot of liberties with it, but I do think it's meant to be quite cryptic, and it's that shortness of phrase. And you can hear from the response that they don't get a lot of meaning from it.
Yeah.
It doesn't help them make a further determination, so that's another sign that it likely is. So whether it's exactly a riddle or a cryptic answer, I certainly think it's cryptic there, yes.
He's saving his neck, which is one of the...
Yeah, well, and he doesn't in the end, but yes, yeah, I mean, you
Well,
know,
yes,
yes.
he's trying to, I suppose he doesn't
Yes.
in the end.
Right, but yes, he's not giving them any fuel for the fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because he's not, I think, buying the question on their terms.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, are you king? You know, it can just, well,
Mm-hmm.
you know, he's king in such a different way, but in some ways, like expectation, so it's that kind of confounding of, yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
his silence also fits that lovely theme in Isaiah of he's silent before. That was the questioning.
And if it had been up to Pilate, he would have saved his neck. But Pilate conceded to the crowd, so, yeah. All right, we do have some online questions.
Okay.
You mentioned mashal and parabole as the ancient descriptors, but we use different categories today, allegory, riddles, etc. Is there any danger in our attempts to be more precise when the ancient descriptors are more inclusive?
That's a great question. You know, so the language is an umbrella term, mashal, parabole. So the fact that Matthew uses the language to both, most of the time, to indicate a story that's coming, so a parable, what we consider typically a story parable, but then sometimes to indicate a saying, like in Matthew 15:15, means we have to keep that umbrella sense and not necessarily say the word tells us something particularly, but it opens up the possibilities. So we can't, with parabole, we can't exclude riddle because, oh no, those are just stories. Of course, we don't want to all say it means riddle. You know, it covers a lot of territory, and I think that's where we don't want to tie, and there is a term for riddle there's in Hebrew as well and in Greek, and that is used in Matthew and in Matthew 13 to talk about sort of the general things are now being uncovered that were once riddles, or were riddles from the foundation of the world. So, so the language shouldn't be tied to the sort of the exactness of pointing to riddle or not riddle. We need to kind of look at the language and say, does this allow for riddle? And so, of course, most of the time when a riddle is given, parabole is not used, and sometimes when a story parable is given, parabole is not used. So we can't map everything right on to the language. The language is suggestive, though, for this wider category.
Okay. One more, and then we'll open it up in here. How widely accepted today is the embedded riddle genre among New Testament scholars? Also among Bible translators where section headings are added. I've often noticed that some of the passages that you mention containing riddles are marked as questions in Bible headings.
Yes. Well, first of all, it was an interesting exercise to start to collect all the places in commentaries, in Matthew commentaries, where riddle language shows up in the commentaries' words, the commentators' words. So there, sometimes only one person identifies one place as a riddle, and other times two or three do. And sometimes when I thought something was a riddle, I didn't find somebody who thought it was a riddle. So I tried to go with the tried and true and say I'm going to work with the texts that most clearly identified by at least a couple scholars as riddles. So it's interesting that any one commentator might only call two or three things in Matthew a riddle, but you gather up all the single references plus maybe a few double references, and suddenly you have about 20 riddles in Matthew. So it was interesting to kind of hear where commentators identify it and where other commentators add to that. So it's kind of a cumulative thing that I did in terms of at least getting my pool of possible riddles. I really don't want to, again, I want to affirm there's not a riddle under every Matthean rock. You know, it really is the case that we look at these criteria and we wonder about it, and you notice I had to my bedside a few points with language of likely, possible, but the one at 2246 or 24, the David's son, David's Lord, that is one that probably across the synoptics is the most, because that shows up in each of Matthew, Mark, Luke, most identified, kind of commonly the chorus sings, this is a riddle, even though some commentators don't mention riddle at all in their commentaries. So that was just an interesting exercise, and I think answers a bit of the question. In terms of, I don't think there's a lot that translators can do other than those headings to maybe signal And I think I know when on the NIV team, and we are in charge of the headings. You know, it's something we vote on. We spend time talking about headings and voting on them, and we want sort of something general enough that can be helpful to guide the reader to the whole passage, and something that will pick up on some of the language in the text. Those are kind of a couple of ways we think about using headings well, so that as a reader of Scripture, you go, oh, now what's coming essentially are some questions that the Jewish leaders ask Jesus. I think going to riddle in a heading is moving too granularly, interpretively granular. So that wouldn't be helpful because, and it would never pass. I mean, we have to have 15 of us to say, yeah, that's a heading that's general enough, but that can be helpful to the reader. So I think it's probably the role of commentators to weigh in whether they think these are riddles or not. That's my guess.
Okay. All right. Questions here in the audience? Go for it.
I'm still kind of turning this over in my head about how to ask it, but a lot of these stories, when I've heard them talked about, I've heard them preached, a lot of people want to come to an answer really quickly. Right, somebody will preach on, is it easier to get in the walk, or is it easier to forgive sins? And they'll be like, oh, this is the answer.
Yeah.
Rather than sit with the ambiguity. And so I guess, I don't know, could you maybe just speak to, like, I don't know, like maybe our culture's desire for right answers, or how we can teach these passages maintaining ambiguity, but also people do want some certainty when you're explaining things to them. I don't know. It's not really a question, it's kind of a field of ideas.
No, I think that's a good question. I do think there's a tendency to like binaries, to like one or the other, kind of either or, and I think commentators, so scholars want to answer questions that the text raises, so they want to say, and I've written in my own commentary, I think it means this, it's easier to do which one, I've written, this is what the text means, or this is what Matthew's up to. And I think this research that I've been doing, that really comes out of my last commentary on Matthew, where I used the language of riddle a few times. I started the sign of Jonah, we'd even talk about the riddle of Jonah. I think it's a riddle. Sign of Jonah is a riddle. They want a sign, he's going to give them a riddle instead, because it's very cryptic for the listeners at that point in the storyline. So I was coming to more of this, I think there are more riddles than I was thinking, and now again, not millions, but as we think about how we preach those, I think I look toward Ben Witherington, who says, we want to ruminate on the possibilities. And if it's meant to be a both and, then preach it as a both and. Not all binaries set up as in a riddle are meant to be both and. That's just kind of one way to go with them. It is in 22:46, that passage 41 through 46. I think it also is in Matthew 9. But sometimes the both and, it's not about the final answer being a both and, but just about holding the tension of this particular reality, whatever is being talked about. So I think it's okay to let people know that Jesus taught with intentional ambiguity. I teach with ambiguity, but that's a whole different thing. So we all teach and we're ambiguous, and our students have to raise their hand. Or I write something in a book and people email me and say, what in the world did you mean by that? I'm like, I wanted to be clear. I wasn't terribly clear. But I would say, the intentional ambiguity is a real powerful vision of what Jesus was trying to do, that sometimes, whether to evade traps or to get people to go a level deeper, he uses a riddle, this ambiguity that helps them not do that quick thing that I think, at least in my cultural context, we're prone to do. We're prone to do a quick answer, right? Answer that real quickly. Easy answer. Not easy answers, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Blythe.
I think Alex's question was mine. I'll frame it and push behind something you said. I was going to ask you whether a sermon and a riddle should explain the riddle or be a riddle in order to communicate it. And then one to say, okay, and I thought that was okay. But then there seemed to be, when you said near the end, I ran into a problem. I loved it. This was great fun.
Because I'm not going to push at it. So.
Thank you for the
Yeah.
lecture. It was so good. I wish people could hear it and listen in so they can preach the genres of the passage rather than points of point. But nevertheless, I won't say we'll stop. You implied that sometimes the characters in Matthew were foils. The people who didn't understand, in contrast to the Matthean readers who should have. Now that employs the issue of clarity, that the riddle is a move to clarity. Whereas I guess I'm appealing to the riddle is the thing, that the clarity itself is ambiguous.
Yeah.
Always.
So I think I was moving there more generally, to not just riddles, but my dissertation was on the Matthean disciples and their struggle to understand. And I do think that provides for the reader this, but I get what, when Peter says, God forbid this should ever happen to you and you shouldn't go to the cross, we're kind of, so it wasn't a riddle. Jesus just said there might be ambiguity in it, but it doesn't really, 16:21 isn't exactly a riddle, his first passion prediction, but it doesn't fit in Matthew's or in Peter's categories at all. He can't, so he pushes back, but we know by that time the introduction to not just the storyline, but we have the introduction. We know Jesus is the Messiah. We're starting to see what kind of Messiah he will be, so that we can understand what they are struggling to understand, especially pre-resurrection. So there I kind of went very broad. I think you're right. I would massage that differently if I was talking about those points where they don't understand a riddle. It contributes to the whole, and I do think there's a foil quality to the disciples. We have this sort of love-hate relationship with them. We're like, we're, because we follow Jesus. We want to be like them, but then, no, we can't be like them there. That's not good. So we do this kind of in and out, very intuitively, kind of foil emulation, back and forth. That was my dissertation, essentially. But I agree that if we're talking about riddles, then we need to maybe have an additional kind of way of thinking of how their misunderstanding functions. Maybe to highlight not just clarity of Jesus' teaching, but ambiguity of Jesus' teaching. The riddle is the thing. Or riddle me this, Batman. Tim really wanted me to say that at some point, so I just had to. Come on. So it didn't fit anywhere in there somehow, so now it did, yeah. But I think, the riddle is the thing. That was your line, I think, so I like that. Yeah.
Another question online. Is there any connection between Jesus as Riddler and Jesus as prophet? The narrator indicates in 21:46 that the crowds regarded Jesus as a prophet.
Yes, and they're right, of course. Matthew wants to highlight Jesus as prophet, Jesus as sage, Jesus as Messiah, Jesus as embodiment of divine presence. I mean, just, the list goes on and on and on, right? I tend to think of the riddling Jesus more in the context of wisdom and of Jesus as sage, but these categories, of course, do bleed together. So their acclamation of him as prophet is from these are the Galilean crowds that have come with him. So they have seen his acts, his miracles. They've heard him speak. They know fits that prophet mold. So I would say this, and Jesus as sage or wisdom is more implicit in Matthew. We don't have any place where Jesus is called a sage, but we get close at points, and we get this very implicit, but I think clear message in chapter 11 that Jesus is even wisdom embodied, which I'll preach about tomorrow morning, so more on that later. So I think I want to affirm Jesus as prophet, and I think it feels like a bit of a different category to me. When Jesus says riddles, he's in that wisdom tradition of trying to express realities that are not easily expressed with language, and also trying to evade traps and other kinds of things that will save his neck for a time. This whole riddling session occurs, depending on how you go, through the text, 4 days, 5 days before Jesus is killed. So it's really, the stakes are high. It's not just an incidental thing that within 4 or 5 days Jesus will be crucified.
It is interesting, I'll just add a bit to that, that in the Old Testament, prophets use mashal, both in the narratives and
Yeah.
in the prophetic books.
There's a,
Yeah,
it's not a neat and tidy
No, it's not.
category
yeah.
difference, yeah.
Dr. Clackney?
God is not the author of confusion, Paul mentions in
Mhm.
1 Corinthians. Is there a sense in which the period of riddling is confined to the prior arrival of the Holy Spirit in the opening of the kind of spiritual awareness that came after Pentecost? Can we assume that the riddles were removed from those people who received the Spirit?
That they could understand the gospel traditions that included riddles. I do think, yeah, and if we frame it in Matthew in terms of after the resurrection, although the disciples, they worship, but they still doubt. There's still ambiguity even afterwards, but in Matthew. But there is this sense of one of the key parts of what Jesus is doing that's so difficult to understand is that he's intentionally going toward a missional death. That just confounds his followers so much. So after the resurrection, things become much clearer. So in Matthew, you don't have the coming of the Spirit yet, in the end of the narrative, so I'll typically default to after the resurrection. But yes, I agree that the coming of the Spirit, post-resurrection, kind of clarity that comes. But I do think the presence of riddles helps me to say, I should be careful not to bring Jesus into a box that I can look at from all sides and understand completely and walk away from. And I know you would never argue for that kind of inspecting Jesus kind of way of looking, but that there's a sense of Jesus will still defy my categories because God does that, and God embodied will do that, I think. So it helps me to hold this sort of tension of the Spirit will help us understand, and Jesus with us, that's Matthew's way of talking about to the end of the age, Jesus is with us. So Jesus will bring clarity, and we will be able to learn from him, chapter 11, learn from me. I will give you rest. But it doesn't preclude this sense that Jesus he's the one who now defies categories. He's the living one after death. There's no one else that fits that category. He's one of a kind. So if he would be a little bit confusing, I think that would be okay. So I'm not into sort of this whole let's obscure everything and just make everything a big question mark. But it is good to hold on to, especially from a context like I think I grew up in, where certainty was the biggest deal. Certainty. We go for certainty. And so instead just being able to hold conviction by faith and trust and have that relationship that I don't have to understand Tim fully to have a deep relationship with him. I don't have to understand, the incarnate God fully to have a relationship. I'm really glad about that. So it kind of gives me that little space in between to say I'm not going to try to master Jesus. There's still mystery here. Yeah.
Mary Beth?
Yes, so I really appreciated both this lecture tonight and last night's lecture, and particularly the way you point us to consider genres that we hadn't, that are in Scripture beyond merely propositional statements. I was wondering, I was intrigued by the information in your bio about your Greek teaching, and it seems to me that the majority of first-year Greek textbooks approach the language in a way that presumes a one-to-one ratio, a one-to-one kind of relationship between the Greek and the Hebrew, and to lead someone to an isomorphic translation of propositional statements. And so this presents students then with one lens through which to view Scripture. And if they continue on and do a lot of reading, they can suddenly, eventually, I guess, break away from that.
Yeah.
But what can be done at the first year level to broaden learners' horizons to consider and appreciate ambiguity in
Yeah.
other similar gradations?
That's a great question. My colleague, I have a colleague who teaches Greek, and he likes to say that at the beginning of the class. He says, I will lie to you consistently throughout this year, because I will say things like the genitive is translated means of, so theou, of God. So I will be lying to you. But it's how we're going to be able to have the building blocks to know that, oh, this word has a number of senses, and we have to look at context to determine which one is applicable in a particular case. So I think kind of owning that at the beginning is a really wise move, because it helps people to say, oh, I have to learn sort of the this is that, but languages don't work that way, as you so nicely said. They don't have an equivalence that's direct. So I mean, that seems to me an important thing. And good linguistics, because if you know two languages and you have a facility in two languages, you know that there's not this just nicely fit together puzzle between the two. So the more we can kind of capitalize on our own intuitions about languages we know. Now, the problem I know in the U.S. is that most people only know one language, so we're kind of stuck in this one way of looking at things. And so we take Greek and we think, oh, it's just these are neat and tidy connections all the way through. So I think somehow disrupting that is really important. And again, my colleague is great, because everybody just laughs and they go on, and then they just kind of know. This is going to be fundamental stuff, building block stuff, and it's going to have to shake it up in second year and hopefully third year.
Danny?
I just want to go back a little bit to what Stuart had said. I wonder if you kind of think of the evangelists as preaching Jesus. It's interesting that, at least for Matthew, he almost never, because he has no problem giving narrative insertions. But for the yeast one, he does. He says, then they understood he was talking about the Pharisees and
Yeah,
Sadducees. But for the majority of the ones that you covered, he never does that.
Yeah.
So he's fine to let the ambiguity sit. That said, one thing you talked about was the context. So I am getting to the question, but I just want to front load it. So the David passage,
which I figured you'd be interested in.
Yes, I'm very interested. And you're correct, because it's what I said in my dissertation.
Good, because I didn't write a dissertation on that section. I was Matthew 16 through 20 primarily.
Yeah. So,
I'll give you 22.
Matthew in his narrative has prepared them to know how to hear that.
Yes.
In other words,
Yes.
the readers at that point shouldn't be that
Right.
ambiguous.
Yeah, it doesn't feel so to the reader, exactly.
That's
Yep.
right. But he doesn't feel the need to, again, insert
Yeah.
a narrative insertion and say, see, I told you, remember how
Yeah.
I said he was the son of David and all this kind of stuff?
Yeah.
He's already framed it.
Yeah.
So this is my question now. Do you think he's done the same thing earlier in the gospel for the Caesar and the denarius question?
So where are you thinking particularly?
I don't know.
Oh, okay, all right. Like, yeah, I mean, there's a temple tax. I'm trying to think of where. That one for me is so. I think because I've heard it preached, and I grew up knowing that these were easily divisible things. I mean, you could Caesar's realms here, God's realms here, spiritual, political. Never the two will meet. It's easy to sort. That slide I had where you could sort things out, it was easy to sort. But I think the context, the social context, just says that's not true at all. Caesar makes absolute claims on his people. God makes absolute claims on God's people. And I've really been helped by Nick Perrin's work on Jesus. I'm thinking it says Jesus the temple, Jesus the priest. One of those two. I think it's Jesus the priest, where he talks about that passage quite in depth. And I steal and borrow and beg from him on that one. That there's no way to answer that question and neatly sort things. These are absolute claims by each. And so he doesn't answer whether they should pay the temple tax, or the imperial tax. I keep saying temple tax. That's in Matthew 17. So he doesn't give an answer in the end, which is the smart thing to do at that point, I think. Yeah.
I remember preaching through Mark
Yeah.
a few years ago, and Ken Myers in his commentary on Mark on that parallel passage argued when it says, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. The fact that he mentions the image is shaming the leaders.
For even having it, right?
Image it, and evidently they have no problem accumulating wealth using an idolatrous image on the coin, but then they want to gripe about paying the taxes to said image. I was insinuating, why don't you just give it all back to Caesar if you have such a big problem?
Yeah. I'm not sure the language requires that. I mean, some translations, and I've read that, this has to mean repay, but I just don't buy that is, that the language requires that. I'm trying to remember exactly the term there, but as I've looked at it from my own commentary, it's not, it can be pay or repay, give to, so it can be pay to or repay.
At least the fact that he brings up the word image.
Well, and
the claim of God be maybe reverse shaming them.
and some people go to, the image of God on humanity. They go in a number of different places with that. What's interesting is not just that they can accumulate wealth, but they have a denarius in the temple courts. They're not supposed to have that. That's why you change your money outside, right? And you come in. They have somebody had the denarius. They're not supposed to have that there. So there's already kind of an implicit, what are you doing? And so they take it out and give him a coin. Give me the coin. I wouldn't give him the coin because I would be like, I'm not supposed to be doing that. I'm supposed to have a different kind of coin that I've changed outside, and now here I am with that coin. So there's already kind of this indictment piece as well there. But I don't know that the language requires repay. I think it can also just mean to pay or give. It can have this sense of returning. That's my understanding of the language there. But I could look more closely as well.
Clear that this isn't commenting on separation of church and state.
And which, of course, in an ancient world is like nobody does that. Nobody knows what that means. Having just worked in Philippians and looking at how the imperial cult weighs on the populace there, especially people that aren't Roman, and Christians who can't go and do this, they're just singular allegiance to Jesus gets them into all sorts of trouble with Caesar's claims on them. It's a pretty dicey situation.
We have another online question. In the afternoon session, you mentioned the importance of cultivating wonder and dumbfoundedness. In what ways might such a posture help us notice and learn from riddles and other creative forms? In your experience, what practices cultivate such wonder, curiosity, and amazement?
That's a lovely question. So in the red couch session, is that what we called it?
I think it's, yes, I think.
Is that right? Sofa, sorry.
Yes.
The red sofa session. I quoted Barbara Brown Taylor, who talks about, given who God is, it might be that the one thing Christians have most in common is dumbfoundedness. That's really what we have in common before our God who defies categories, maybe. So cultivating that. Again, I grew up in a context where certainty was really important, and I knew in my bones that I was supposed to be an apologist for the Bible. I love studying the Bible, but I knew that I had to be an apologist for it. I grew up in the years of the battle for the Bible, and also, dates myself here, but so I when I found out that I could study the Bible and be an interpreter and dive deep and not have to be the apologist for it, I was so relieved. But somehow I knew in my mind I had to be certain and be an apologist and convince other people through proofs and arguments. And so I'm just very drawn to dumbfoundedness, even though I want so much to understand. So I'll tell you another story. I was in a Bible study when I was a young adult, and we were talking about we were in the Minor Prophets, because we're in Bible Study Fellowship, we're in the Minor Prophets. And I asked a question, and I wasn't expecting that we'd all be able to have a quick answer to, but I was just raising a question that I was really curious about. I can't remember what it was. And the leader said, well, I guess we'll have to wait till we get to heaven to know the answer to that question. like,
Stop response.
it's just like this, that was so unsatisfying. And I didn't need her to answer the question. I just needed to let the question sit for me. And maybe I should have just kept my mouth shut, which is probably what I should have done. But this sense that I really want to know and I want to learn more, and I love studying, and I could do this the rest of my life, which I probably will do as long as God gives me strength. But there's nothing easy or simple or now we've done that, tie it up in a bow and walk away. And just especially as I look at whole books of the Bible, and New Testament particularly, which will captivate me for the rest of my career, there's just no way to kind of walk away from that and go, well, that's all done, on to the next. So I take a break from Matthew, move to Philippians, but I'm going to have to go back, right? And it's really fun to go back. So I don't know if that answered it all.
The part of the question was, in what ways might such a posture of dumbfoundedness help us notice and learn from riddles and other creative forms?
Yeah, I think that rumination that Witherington calls for, that's really helped me to think about how do I ruminate on something that seems very familiar. The sayings of Jesus are rightly and wonderfully very familiar to us. How do we go back for a second look? How do we consider, especially when a referent, something is kind of open-ended, how do we sit with it and yet still go to the context for more answers? More answers doesn't mean fewer questions in my experience. So seeking answers doesn't shut down the question asking or the arising of more questions. But our faith is not one of confusion. So I'll go back to John's point. There's a lot of clarity around a lot of areas, and because we're called into relationship, we can again know someone and still have more to learn about someone. So that idea that God knows me may be more important than I fully know God. God fully knows me. So those kinds of postures seem to be helpful to me.
Okay.
Think relationally. Be curious.
Okay.
Is that it?
I think that's it. Let's give her a rest, but let's say thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And good night. See you tomorrow, 11:15.